If CO2 levels are not balanced, it will lead to all kinds of issues, the biggest one being algae. So, how do you go about balancing CO2? Well, first, we need to know how to actually measure CO2. A very simplistic way of doing so is using a CO2 drop checker. Drop checkers use a special solution that lets you know if you have a good amount of CO2 via color. We get blue for not enough, green for the right amount, and yellow for too much CO2. The way it works is that over time, CO2 fills up the air in the checker. The solution is basically a pH testing solution with 4 DKH water, meaning that the CO2 in the checker will change the solution's pH, thus giving out color change. However, there is a certain drawback. That being, it takes about an hour for CO2 to fill up the checker, which delays an accurate reading. Meaning that when you're trying to tweak your CO2, you have to wait about an hour to see if you got the right amount, every single time. Although, drop checkers are the most common method of measuring CO2, but it's not the only way. This is a pH-KH chart. You take the pH and KH of your tank and find where they intersect on the chart, and boom! That's your CO2 concentration in ppm. Except it's kinda wrong. You see, CO2 is not the only variable that can affect your pH levels. Things like tannins, chemicals, and even hardscape can influence pH. Moreover, the chart assumes that KH and CO2 are the only variables that influence pH. So if you have any of these in your tank and you perform a reading, it may give a false positive reading. But what about bubble count? Bubbles per second, or BPS, is the rate it takes for one bubble of CO2 to come out of the CO2 tank and is visualized through the use of bubble counters. In a sense, it measures how much CO2 you're injecting. Depending on the size of the tank determines your ideal BPS. For example, 1 bubble per 5 seconds, or 0.2 BPS for a 5-gallon tank. Go any higher than that and it may lead to difficulties. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to find out your ideal BPS. However, BPS can be full of bull. Bubble sizes may differ with each bubble counter. Even more, diffusion method also may play a part, your plant mass, and how much CO2 spreads around the tank. But those aren't the only things that can influence CO2. Any surface agitation will decrease CO2 levels, how heavy your lighting and fertilization is, and even more, the temperature of the water can also have an effect on how much CO2 water can hold. In this experiment, we have 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, one at room temperature and the other a lot colder. Opening them, you'll hear the difference in air pressure. Even more, when I pour them into a glass, you can notice how much more bubbles the colder one has compared to the warmer one. This is because as the temperature of water decreases, the solubility of carbon dioxide in water increases, and vice versa. A better way would be to use one of these methods in unison with observation. By that, I mean observing how your livestock and plants react to CO2 if you're adding it. If your fish are gasping for air at the top or they're lethargic, then obviously you have too much CO2. For plants, be on the lookout for any stunned growth and smaller leaves. Also, just a heads up, it may take up to a full week for the plants to get adjusted to new CO2 levels. Balancing CO2 can be a long journey that requires a lot of patience, fine-tuning, and experimentation. There's a chance you may mess up and spawn horrible algae, but once you find that sweet spot, you'll never have to touch it again. Trust me, it is worth the journey. And since everyone's journey may differ, if you have some tips or tricks or anything else that I didn't mention, let us know in the comments below. It may also help me out in the future. However, if you do end up getting algae in your journey, here's an algae guide where I go over every algae you may encounter in your aquarium in under 5 minutes.